Hello, today's review will be about a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE 5G that I have available for a couple of days for this. I have to say that this video is not supported in any way but by Samsung or any other dealer. It's a review that is being made as fair and as close as possible to my expectations regarding the products and other details. So it should be relatively objective. What kind of device we are having in front of us? Well, it's an upper mid-range model, not a particularly fantastic one, but clearly one that could be considered mainstream. And I will first present some details about it. It's a 6.4 inches screen with a top resolution of 1080 by 2400 pixels. So it's quite good for its size. It has a main camera of 12 megapixels, 6 or 8 gigabytes of RAM depending on model, and chipset that is a Snapdragon 888 with 5G and Wi-Fi 6 networking capability. The main battery, of course, it's lithium ion at 4500 milliamps hour. The phone was released in 2022, so it's very new in most aspects. The main screen, I think, is the most important part of the phone. Of course, there are phones that have also an additional screen, but this one has a main screen, which is actually entirely logical. The display is dynamic AMOLED 2X, having 120 frames per second capability, 120 Hz, and it supports HDR10+, which means that working with graphical items or trying to show various pleasant images on the screen will have a very good accuracy. And I'm expecting nothing less, since the screen is obviously developed by Samsung, and Samsung has the best OLED screens. All right. So regarding storage, we have 6 gigabytes of RAM. As mentioned, you could have had 8 gigabytes, and a standard 128 or 256 gigabytes available. Of course, the model we are seeing, since it has less RAM, it also has less storage capacity. In general, those things go along, and I do not see any sort of issue with that. There are 3 cameras, as mentioned before: the wide, the telephoto, and the ultra-wide camera. Both the ultra-wide and wide cameras are 12 megapixels, so relatively less than the top-of-the-line models that have at least 16 megapixels. But I think that the most important part is the sensor, and as you will see from some test pictures and other details I will show, it's not a spectacular camera. Of course, it's a mid-range model, but when you see the moniker Galaxy S21, perhaps you should have expected more. Just as well, the FE moniker, which means probably fan edition or cut down version, will temper most of these expectations. It has Bluetooth 5, Wi-Fi 6 or AX networking capability, so a very good and high performance chipset is integrated. It has USB Type-C, which is quite expected. Unfortunately, one of the aspects I'm not very fond of, it seems to have only a single SIM card slot, and worse than that, it has no SD card support, which is very hard to understand when we are talking about a mid-range model, and there are mid-range models that have dual SIM card capability and also have an SD card slot. So I'm not quite sure why those cost or feature cuts, to be most likely, because in terms of cost I think that their impact is minimal, have been made by Samsung in order to release this model. It has fast charging support, up to 25 watts, which is expected from top of the line and also some mid-range models from Samsung, which is quite good. Unfortunately, it's still far off the Huawei and other Chinese brands that can have up to 45 watts fast charging capability. In general, I cannot say that fast charging capability at high power is entirely something you would like, except in extreme cases, because it would lead to faster battery charging, but it will also reduce the battery's lifetime, as well as having an impact on its reliability. Due to the fact that the battery charging is so sudden, you will have it exhausted far quicker in a couple of years. And of course, there is a lot of heat being released, so there are other issues with long-term reliability of the phone that have to be taken into consideration. On the other hand, having 45 watts charging capability means that in a rush you can do much more. In the case of this model, you only have 25 watts, but you also have wireless charging capability at around 15 watts, which should be desirable or acceptable in some use scenarios. So if you have had, or if you would like to have a phone that charges wirelessly, this one is a decent model. In terms of price, I don't think this model fares particularly well, because you can find it at around probably 400 something euros or dollars, which is not particularly great when you consider that there are other mainstream models that do not fare far from it, and particularly have much better capability if we are talking about the SD card slot in particular. So I think that next it is advisable to see how it fares. So let me show you one of the first benchmarks I have in mind, and that is the speed test one. Okay, I think that the page has not loaded. I don't know exactly why. No problem, I think that we can do it again. Since we are not very far from the router, I'm expecting a performance that is going to be quite high, over 300 megabits per second. Okay, we reached around 440, which is not a bad value. In general, laptops or larger devices could easily have around 500 or so, close to 600 megabits per second, but this is not a bad value for a mobile phone. I will not show you the 5G networking capability, because in general it's much less important, and you also have to consider the fact that 5G networks are still not at the level of performance you may expect considering the technology. Alright, so let's talk about the camera, but because I think this one is the next likely aspect you will be concerned when using such a device. So let's look on the camera. Now I don't want to turn location tags for the moment. If you look closely at the screen, you will notice that it responds quite well. Of course, I'm using the 120 Hz setting, so the frame rate is higher. Let's also see how good a photo it can make. This is a photo I made previously. And despite its blandness, I think that we can right off the bat see some details, and I will comment upon them. I think that the most important culprit with most phones is still the way in which processing is done and how much control or lack of control you have on it. As you can see, there is an enhanced stage, which is actually unpleasant in most cases because it will lead to fringes or other unpleasant artifacts, because most phones still apply an unsharpening mask, and this makes edges more visible, but on the other hand it affects the picture quality. As you can see over here, there is a large noise that can be noticed on a part that is relatively obscured, or there is a small shadow. Of course, we are not talking about an intense lighting situation, but this shows very well limitations of the camera. Another part, that is probably this one, also shows a lot of noise. If this is acceptable or not depends on you. However, I still think that the performance of such a model is lacking, and I don't think that it shows any advantage over mainstream or mid-range models that are relatively cheaper, also from Samsung. I'm thinking mostly at the A20 series, which covers A20, A10, A1, 22, 23. Some of them also have the same camera and graphics capability. So this is why I'm not finding this model to be anything special in particular. I'm thinking if there is something else. Yes, you can also see a lot of detail being lost in the picture. I have used, of course, the main camera, and the fact is that on the fingers there are some dips that could be much better represented. So I still think that it's quite a lacking camera, and there is no effort being placed on offering a decent offering anything more than a decent picture, because the picture itself is not bad, but you have to consider it's a 2022 model, of course not a top-of-the-line model, but it has a performance that is not far from 2018 top-of-the-line model. So if you're thinking about an S8 or an S9 phone, I think that the performance would be quite similar, or perhaps even lower in the case of this particular model than the older ones, which from my point of view is not a great performance. All right, next let me show you how fast it can render something. We are looking at London because I think it's quite highly packed city. It's very densely constructed, and this means that the whole area is going to be well represented, and means that it's going to be a good test for how fast rendering and processing works. Of course, when parts of the image are being generated and parts of the geometry and the texturing, it's also a partial lag due to the networking and decoding that must take place. All right, I think that we covered quite well this test. It works fine. The lag is very low, and I think that the image being generated is quite smooth. So as you can see, if I'm letting it turn, it has a very smooth movement. Alright, so let's move to the last part of the test I wanted to show to you, the performance test. So these are the specifications for the model. You can see Android 12, so it's quite fine. If you would like to know, I have to say that battery saving features are not active for the moment. This would have led to a slightly lower performance, but also battery time improvement. And you can see right off the bat the efficiency and the performance cores, 4 efficiency cores, 4 performance cores. The efficiency cores ran at most at 2.4 gigahertz, while the performance, the efficiency ones are running at 1.8 gigahertz maximum, minimum frequency 300 megahertz, and 700 for the performance ones. The amount of memory being used, of course, because I run quite a demanding application, reached 4 gigabytes, and this shows that having any less than 6 gigabytes of RAM is a very bad decision on a phone model, and probably most models should have been released with at least 8 gigabytes to have enough capability. And let's run the benchmark and see what else we will see. So 9 gigabytes used. This is mostly a base installation with just a few applications, so you can have around 90 something gigabytes when you finish installing all your applications. Not bad in itself, but unfortunately the storage cannot be improved because there is no support for an SD card slot. So you have to keep that in mind very well. If you're going to buy a 128 or a 256 gigabyte model, this is everything you will have. So let's run the benchmark. When running the benchmark, I have to make some small comments. First of all, I'm not expecting the phone to have stellar performance. I'm not expecting it to have a bad one either, but you have to keep your expectations in check. Another very important aspect in 2D and 3D graphics tests, we will not have the highest performance, mostly due to the fact that I wasn't able to find a way to disable vertical sync or frame rate synchronization. And this means that in some cases we could have probably seen an improved top frame rate. On the other hand, this is not entirely important because there are places where the performance clearly dips below the screen's frame rate, below 120 Hertz or even less than that. So actually you will have quite a good way of assessing the performance. The storage performance, I'm not expecting it to be particularly high. In general, Wiki'ds are at quite a low value in terms of megabytes per second, and this is to be expected because we are not talking about a top-of-the-line model. On the other hand, I'm expecting it to fare decent in this area as well. And regarding the 3D graphics test, as mentioned, there will be some slowdowns noticeable, and I think that you should pay particular attention to these slowdowns, because if you have demanding games or any 3D application that should be running well, this is the first the first area where you will see and be slightly disappointed by the model. Of course, I'm not expecting, as mentioned, stellar performance, because we are talking about mostly a mid-range mobile phone, even if the way in which it's presented would suggest that it's upper mid-range, because you're talking about a model that is not far off the top one. Of course, at the moment, the Galaxy S22 has been released already, so S21 is not the top of the line model anymore. So it's more like what you would get if you would have probably in the marketing, let's say, perspective, the phone of yesterday or of the previous year, which is very far off that, and this is the particular aspect I would be concerned, because it's not an S21 in any way. It's just mid-range model. As you can see, sometimes performance dips below 120, so you're not having top performance. In this test, which is not that complex, I think that it could be running at around 200 frames per second or something along that, but it's capped due to the screen's frame rate. And what you're seeing as slight slowdowns is due to the fact that the screen updates at a higher frame rate per second than the camera. Alright, less than 120 Hertz in some areas, 120 frames per second, and it dips as low as 57, 58. So not a great performance in some demanding games as mentioned, but this is not a gaming phone or one that has strong performance. So this is not something that I would be particularly concerned about. Alright, those are the results. Alright, so for the disk 240 megabytes per second, it's a decent performance, but not particularly fantastic. The 2D graphics sets, there have been some slowdowns in certain tests, so it still doesn't fare as well as you would hope. The 3D graphics test has shown frame rates that were sometimes below those values, and I think that the biggest letdown with such benchmarks is that they do not put emphasis on the minimum frame rate that was achieved, because this is much more important than the average or the top one, because slowdowns are going to be much more noticeable in practice than if it gets from average to top. But the average value shows a rough picture of what you would expect. So clearly not the top performance for this screen or this particular design. So I think that we also should have some closing remarks. Do I think that this model justifies the asking price? No, I think it's a bit overpriced considering its features, and I have nothing to say about that. It's a model that doesn't fare particularly bad, but leaves a lot to be desired, at least when you consider the fact that it should be not far off the previous year model, and actually it's very far. The camera is just your run-of-the-mill or standard mid-range phone camera with all its, let's say, disappointments. The chipset on the phone is quite reasonable, but I think the graphics performance is poor. The biggest highlight of the phone is the screen, because it's an 120 Hz one and it has good performance. And it's of course an OLED screen made by Samsung, so a top of the line feature over there. On the other hand, having limited storage is, I think, an important reason why I cannot recommend such a purchase. And of course, another detail, the support for a single SIM card slot. In today's world, I think is not that great when electronic SIM or eSIM capability is not present. So not a bad model, but still one that I would not recommend when you think that there are so many other models from Samsung and other manufacturers that have OLED screens, have at least more storage or better camera performance than this one. But if you like the phone's size and its format, I think that it's up to you to decide if it's a good enough reason to buy one. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like, please subscribe to the channel and leave comments if you would like to share your thoughts. So have a nice day.